Thank you very much, Niladri, and thank you to the JNU students and teachers for inviting me to speak at this on this occasion, the new series on Azadi. I must also offer you my profound apologies for the delay in my arrival. I believe there were many others who had come and had to leave. I won't give you a story about why and how it took me nearly 10 hours to come from Kolkata to Delhi, because I am told that making any disparaging remarks on the national airline has been declared unconstitutional. Azadi is the topic, and once again I have to commend the students of JNU for restoring to a perfectly good Hindustani word which is used, I think, in every North Indian language, to restore to it its full range of meanings, because in the recent past the word somehow had been reduced to a kind of label, and very often even used pejoratively to mark out people associated especially with the movement in Kashmir. I think it is very important to understand that even that movement and similar movements are part of a much larger set of demands, claims, negotiations that have to do with the broader theme of freedom. And that will be my topic today. So one of the things that we are being told every day now is that freedom is not unlimited, that freedom cannot be absolute. Now this, it seems to me, is a fairly obvious thing. Freedom has never been absolute or unlimited. Everyone knows this. At a very basic level, there are surely natural limits to our freedom to do things. So, I am not free to run like Usain Bolt, even if I wanted to. I cannot be at two places at the same time, right? I cannot jump from the roof and say I will fly to the moon. When I'm sitting here among you at this campus, I'm feeling I wish I had been 25 again. It's not possible. These are natural limits. There are natural limits within which we have to think of what we can or cannot do. But it's important to remember that by acting upon these natural forces, energies, movements, it is possible for human beings to creatively expand their range of freedom. That, in fact, is the very source of creative innovation. From basic things like production to all of the developments of science and engineering, technology and art. That is fundamentally what human beings do, which is act upon the various forces of nature in order to creatively expand the range of things one can do. So I said that, for instance, one cannot be at two places at the same time, or cannot fly to the moon. Even that is possible today, to fly to the moon, which is an expression of how freedom could be expanded by creatively using the forces of nature. But more often we tend to think of the question of freedom in terms of social and political constraints. And that will obviously have to be the larger part of our discussion today. Let me begin by saying that these social and political conditions and the way in which freedom is limited by social and political conditions have two different aspects which need to be thought of differently. One is the question of individual freedoms, and the other is collective freedoms. And I will explain why I think we should think of those two things as requiring somewhat different understandings. As far as individual freedoms are concerned, they are limited. They are limited in a lot of ways. Or let's begin, rather than begin from some abstract theoretical propositions, let's begin with the way in which our present social and political setup, broadly defined by, let us say, the Constitution, how that defines individual freedom. We all know Article 19, which gives us the right of freedom to speech, to movement, to residence, to, 3 or 4 different things, right? Each of them is actually limited. Some of these limitations are in the Constitution itself. So, for instance, speech, for instance, is specifically limited in the Constitution by specific other provisions. They are also limited by other laws which have been passed by Parliament. But if you think of the broad range, let's think of speech again. It is not as though we are free to speak anything, anywhere, in any setting, in any situation, right? So, for instance, what is acceptable speech, let us say in a gathering of young males, would not be acceptable in a mixed company, right? What can be said on the sports field cannot be said in a classroom. We can think of many situations. What can be said in front of elders is different from what can be said among one's own peers. These are specific institutional sites where there are specific conventions, practices, which restrict what is acceptable speech and what is not. We all accept this. In each of these cases, there are authorities which regulate this, which impose this, sometimes even punish. We have all gone through this. Even punish people for inappropriate speech. We should also remember that these conventions or practices undergo change, which obviously means that these practices are often challenged, they are questioned. Over time, we can easily see, for instance, even in our own experience over the last decades, or, for instance, think of what might have been acceptable speech for an upper caste person speaking to a lower caste person maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, would not be acceptable today in many public spaces. That is a change. These changes have come about because, of course, conventional practices have been challenged, there have been new claims have been made, and very often the conventions and practices have changed. The crucial thing to remember is that in these kinds of settings or situations, the state is not the agency that regulates, right? What is said, or what can or cannot be said inside a family, what can or cannot be said in a private gathering, what can or cannot be said even in a society, in an association, in a club, even in a public meeting, is not something that is meant to be regulated by the state. Right? Now, the interesting question, therefore, is what does the state guarantee? So, think of a situation where, let us say, in a community, where the community elders claim that their conventional social practices prevent young women from going out into town or studying in a college with male students, right? They are trying to impose a certain conventional practice. That practice may come under challenge, right? The question is, if that young woman goes to the state and claims protection of her individual freedom, the state is bound to guarantee and protect that person. In other words, what I'm saying is that in a constitutional democracy, when there is a question of, let us say, freedom of speech, or freedom of movement, freedom of association, any of these freedoms that are guaranteed under Article 19, the default position of the state must always be to protect individual freedom. There may well be exceptions. These exceptions may be negotiated. There may be court rulings. It could be subject to dispute. But as I'm saying, the default position must always be that the state protects individual freedoms. If it does not, then really it is no longer a constitutional democracy. It becomes tyranny. There is no other. That is, in fact, the definition of tyranny, where the state does not protect individual freedoms. This will be important in the case of the university, for instance. In fact, I will suggest that in the case of a constitutional democracy, there are two institutions in particular where freedom of speech must have a special protection, must be given special protection. One are bodies of elected representatives, such as parliament, such as the state assemblies. And we all know that, in fact, that is the accepted legal position, that in parliament or in assemblies, what can or cannot be said is regulated by parliament itself or the state assembly itself. Not even the courts can decide. That is understood as parliamentary privilege. I would claim that the university should also have a similar status. It is important because just as the people's representatives are precisely the place where demands and claims and contestations that occur in society at large are in fact put before the state. The parliament or the assembly is the organ of the state which represents the sovereignty of the people. There is no other institution which does. That is the institution which represents the sovereignty of the people. And if that is the case, then in fact, those who have been elected by the people as their representatives must have complete freedom to say what they have to say in that house without any other organ of the state interfering. In the case of the university, the claim would be this, that if freedom of thought and expression is the foundation of any kind of critical and creative thinking in society at large, and this means the entire range of things I mentioned to you earlier on at the very beginning when I said that the creative innovation to expand human freedoms, that depends fundamentally on knowledge, on the ability to use knowledge, to use that knowledge critically, to question existing rules, conventions, institutions. That is the basis on which science progresses, on the basis of which critical thinking progresses, art progresses. And the university is in fact the one institution where this is precisely the job of teachers and students, to promote this kind of critical thinking. As a result, it seems to me one of the absolutely foundational implications of freedom of speech and thought and expression is that the university be completely self-regulated. That is to say, what can or cannot be said in a university, what can or cannot be said in a classroom or a seminar or even a meeting like this, it is the authorities of the university, teachers and students together, who should decide what is acceptable and what is not. Now, everything is not acceptable. We all know this. Even in the classroom, surely there are things that are said which are irrelevant, things that are said which are confused, things that are said which are plain wrong. And of course, it is the duty of whoever is the institution. For instance, if it was in my class, I could certainly tell a student to say, look, this is why you're wrong, you better stop now. We'll move on to something else. But it is the university authorities who best know what is or is not acceptable speech within the university. I think it is completely not only wrong, but even impertinent for state authorities to decide what can or cannot be said in a university. Now, let's move on to one other thing, which is this question of, can speech, any kind of speech, in a university campus, and we can extend that to other arenas of society as well, outside the campus too, be declared seditious. Now, the sedition question, I'm sure you've discussed this many times. I don't have to go into this in detail. The law as it exists is clearly incompatible with any kind of constitutional democracy that is based on the sovereignty of the people. It is simply incompatible. And the reason is this, that the law actually says, it does not say even the state. It says government as established by law. And one understands why it was framed that way in the 1860s when it was first framed. The government at the time, the colonial government, was of course external to the people over whom the government ruled. The government was an outside entity, which is why there was no question, obviously, of representation. The government did not represent the people of India. Now, as a result, it is perfectly understandable why any kind of expression of disloyalty or disaffection would have threatened a colonial government. And therefore, the colonial government could lay down that incredibly broad scope of what is or is not seditious. Even speech is seditious there. But that is a law which has continued, and we can, I mean, there are very interesting things about why, for instance, in the 50s and 60s, this law was very seldom used, in fact. And that is obviously because of this, of its association with an entire history of nationalist struggle where virtually every nationalist of any description was at some time or other charged with sedition. So in the 50s and 60s, it was in fact rarely used. It began to be used once more from the 70s. And in recent times, it has become rampant, even though the courts have repeatedly said that there must be a distinction between advocacy and incitement. Right? The courts have never quite gone to the extent of saying it is unconstitutional, although some of the judgments almost seem to go that far. But they haven't. What they have said is that mere speech and even advocacy cannot mean sedition. You have to show the actual imminent threat of harm or injury to the state. Now, we all know that many of these cases, these sedition cases, don't actually stand up in court, but it is a widespread, there is a widespread use of that act to harass, intimidate, and threaten people. Any kind, according to that law, any kind of opposition to government, and remember, the government means any government elected by the people, right? The government of the day. Any statement that is deemed to be critical or claiming disaffection or inciting, not inciting, advocating disaffection towards the government of the day, which means any kind of opposition to the government, can be declared seditious. It is, I think, an act which certainly must go. That is a claim that needs to be made repeatedly. Let me now move on to from individual freedoms to something like collective Azadi. Okay? And let me begin by saying that this understanding of a collective notion of freedom or Azadi, something that pertains to an entire group, is actually difficult to make, it's difficult to contain within a strictly liberal understanding of the Constitution. Because, as we all know, the liberal understanding is fundamentally based on a notion of individual freedoms. So a collective freedom is always difficult to formulate in strictly liberal terms. But there are certain kinds of collective rights that historically have been recognized, even within liberal constitutional systems. And the most obvious one is the question of national self-government or self-determination. Now, this has happened, of course, through an entire history of anti-imperial and anti-colonial struggles, that this right has been accepted to the extent that the United Nations, for instance, this is one of the declarations that was part of the history of the founding of the United Nations, the right of all peoples and nations to self-determination. But when one thinks of collective freedoms, I think it is important to understand that it rests on something, and this is slightly different, which is why I was saying that individual freedoms and collective freedoms, Azadi in the individual and collective sense, have to be thought of somewhat differently. Because in the collective sense, it actually depends on a certain relationship of an oppressed side and an oppressor side. if you think through this idea of collective freedoms, you will find that in every case, the claim to some collective right to autonomy is based on a perception that there is an oppressor who is holding a particular group in subjection. That is what is contested, resisted, and that is the foundation of a claim to self-rule or autonomy or self-determination. If you think of the history of anti-colonial nationalism, this becomes obvious. That anti-colonial nationalism basically is founded on the idea that there are oppressor nations and oppressed nations. And it is the right of the oppressed nation to claim self-determination or independence from the oppressor nation. We all know that through the history of the anti-colonial movements, this right of national self-determination has been, by the, let's say, the second half of the 20th century, this right was more or less universally established. But it's important to remember that this right was established in a way that had two very specific characteristics. First of all, it was a resolution that was territorial. The national self-determination or national autonomy was always conceived of as a claim over a particular territory with clear boundaries. This is, there's the whole history to be described here of how this idea of nations as having territorial boundaries emerged in Europe, through maybe from the 17th century onwards, and was carried on to the rest of the world through the colonial empires, in fact, where the colonial empires between themselves drew boundaries to define which part of the world belongs to which colonial power. Some of you may know of the infamous Berlin Conference of 1885, where basically on a drawing board, the various imperial powers sat down and divided up Africa. One of the peculiar things you will notice if you look at the map of Africa is that most of the boundaries are along longitudes and latitudes. They are simply drawn on a map, right, and divided up. This is French, this is Portuguese, this is British, etc. Now, so the territorial jurisdiction, a unique sovereignty over a territory, is the first characteristic. And the second characteristic is the claim, and this of course is a more recent claim, this is the success of the anti-colonial movements, to claim that all sovereignties are formally equal, which explains why in the General Assembly of the United Nations, every member state, irrespective of whether it is large or small, has exactly one vote, which signifies the formal equality of all nations, the sovereignty of all nations. Now, the reason I explain this is because if you then look at how collective claims are negotiated within the boundaries of a nation, you will find that in fact the same structure is replicated. So, for instance, think of countries where there are separate units that together form a federation. So there are many federal countries in the world, including India. The degree of federation, how much the sovereignty is divided up, what is the proportion in which power is divided, between a central government and the various state or provincial governments, that varies. But if you again look at why there are claims that there should be a separate federal unit, why does it come up? You will find that it is once again the same claim of an oppressed side and an oppressor side. If we look at the history of the Indian state or the Indian Federation from the time of independence, and you look at the various claims that have been made over time, some of you may have read about the anti-Hindi agitation in the Tamil areas in Madras, right, led by Periyar, where in fact a specific claim was made that the Tamil-speaking parts should secede from India. It was a claim that was made at the time. And of course, both the Congress in Madras as well as the rest of many sections of opinion, the rest of India thought this was a threat to national unity itself. Now, the interesting thing to note is that claims like this and their resolution are never permanent. There is never a permanent claim, nor is there a permanent settlement. The Tamil case is interesting because, of course, that movement of the early 1950s, we now know, later became completely incorporated within the framework of constitutional electoral democracy in the form of the two main Dravida parties, which are inheritors of Tamil nationalism, but no longer considered a threat to national unity. Think of the Andhra movement, 1954, demanding a separate state for the Telugu-speaking regions, which of course then led to the entire demand for reorganizing all of the provinces of India into linguistic states, the States Reorganization Commission. By 56, most of the states began this process of redrawing the boundaries of the states according to linguistic regions. Even Nehru was opposed to this because he thought this would break up India. The recognition of the linguistic principle as the principle of federal divisions would break up India. Well, Nehru was wrong, we know, because it was not a threat. You move on to a whole range of claims which later became the basis for dividing up existing states into smaller states. Right? Jharkhand, Telangana. Telangana is a very interesting case because if you now compare it with the Andhra case of the 50s, right? In the 50s, one might have thought, well, the regional demand, the cultural claim to autonomy has been resolved because we now have an Andhra state based on language. Well, Telangana comes up. I remember a time in the 1970s and 80s when the demand for Telangana, the demand for Jharkhand were opposed because the claim was these claims would simply lead to the breakup of the country. It didn't. Telangana is now a separate state. Jharkhand is now a separate state, right? There is a demand, for instance, in Darjeeling for the Gorkha peoples to have their own state, right? The interesting thing is that the present ruling party has been for the last 10 years representing Darjeeling in Parliament. This same Gorkhaland movement is represented by a BJP MP. So you can think of how these kinds of claims actually work. The point, therefore, is that in each of these cases, whether it's Jharkhand, whether it's Telangana, whether it's Gorkhaland, everywhere the claim is that there is some fundamental injustice that is being done to a collective group which has its identity. There is some oppressor group outside which is oppressing it, and the claim is that this group must have the right to form its own political entity. In other words, sovereignty of the state, of the nation state, must be divided up further territorially. That sovereignty must be devolved to this oppressor group, to this currently oppressed group, in order to make it free, Azad. You can connect this whole discussion to claims that are now being made in the Northeast, claims that is being made in Kashmir. Now, of course, that's an old, more than 60 years that the problem in Kashmir has not been resolved. What I'm suggesting is that there's nothing special or supremely dangerous in these claims. These are claims that have been made, that are being negotiated right now. And the argument that somehow a claim to a separate identity, no matter what the specific form of the resolution, will depend on the politics that is allowed. If constitutional politics does not allow a certain kind of claim to be made, well, unconstitutional means will be taken. That is the nature of politics. But this is what I am arguing, that if in fact national self-determination is so obvious and sacrosanct, then the devolution of that sovereignty territorially within the nation state, within the boundaries of the nation state, cannot be opposed. That is a negotiation that continues, and it's a negotiation that ought to be allowed space. This, therefore, is the problem I have about people who say that any kind of talk of Azadi in a collective sense is somehow anti-national and advocating the breakup of the country is simply false. It is simply false, because, as I've been saying, each single case from the time of the demand in the Tamil regions to Telangana to the linguistic states to all of the smaller states like Jharkhand and so on and so forth, have all been based on essentially that same claim. Let's move on to something else that is relevant here. Which, of course, deals with the specific question of who it is that can declare a particular demand or claim as anti-national. Now, there is really no constitutional body or constitutional provision, right, which declares any kind of renegotiation of the terms of the constitution of the state as unconstitutional. There is no such thing. We have been told recently that somehow the Constitution is inviolable. No question can be raised about the Constitution. It's a very peculiar claim to make, because if that is so, then no amendment of the Constitution would be possible. Surely any amendment of the Constitution will require questioning this or that provision of the Constitution. Otherwise, why is ever a demand for a constitutional amendment made? As I said, every single claim of forming new states requires a constitutional amendment. It changes the constitution of the country. In fact, if you think of it, from 1947 or 1950, if you take the inauguration of the Constitution as essentially forming the birth of the nation state as we know it, these changes in the internal constitution of the state itself has changed the nature of the nation state. The Indian nation state, as it was in the 1950s, is not what it is today. This is an entire historical process that has gone on and that will go on. The claim actually that is being made today, it seems to me, is not so much that there is a threat of any kind of breakup of the country. That is not the claim. What is being claimed by a ruling party is that we will define what is the content of the national, and we will identify people who will be put to the test of proving that they are not anti-national. That is what is being claimed. If you think of what is being attempted here, you will find this is completely compatible with the very definition of fascism. This is what fascist parties have always done. To identify people, target people, and then ask them to prove that they are not anti-national. If we move on to one final set of questions, issues, and then I will stop and you can take questions, which is the connection between what I spoke of as individual freedoms and these collective freedoms. Now, the individual freedoms and collective freedoms, I said, should be understood differently, but there is a connection between the two. Because the claim to individual freedoms cannot be pursued or asserted without a collective movement. This also is important to understand. Many of these individual freedoms, such as speech or movement or livelihood and so on and so forth, depend on things like income, occupation, status in society, right? Dignity. All of those are supports or bases for the pursuit of individual freedoms or the enjoyment of individual freedoms, right? There is no point in saying that one is free to associate if one does not even have the basic means of subsistence. These, therefore, form the foundations of the pursuit of a free life as free citizens. But these individual freedoms, which may in some cases be acquired individually, cannot have a permanent effect on society unless entire groups, entire classes, entire communities can attain those levels of income and livelihood and health and education and all of those things. The connection is there. So as a result, what appears to be individual freedoms actually have a foundation in the collective pursuit of those freedoms, to be able to combine with others in a movement, in a collective claim for better incomes, for education, for health, for a life of dignity. Now, this obviously relates to questions such as caste and class and gender, because those are inequalities, deep inequalities, which make the pursuit of individual freedoms sometimes impossible. We all know that, yes, there are individual cases where people from certain persons from extremely marginalized and impoverished backgrounds, communities, could improve their individual chances and attain that status of enjoying the freedoms that are offered by the Constitution, for instance. But those individual cases will not make a difference to the community as a whole, right? So as a result, the argument that the collective pursuit of these social and economic objectives is also a part of collective freedoms or collective Azadi is a very, very valid argument. Without it, individual freedoms cannot be defended. So therefore, there is a connection here then between these kinds of inequalities, and sometimes in many of these cases there is actual oppression too. The difference with the cases we have spoken of earlier is that these kinds of relations of exploitation and oppression based on caste, for instance, or gender, cannot be resolved territorially. That is the crucial difference. You cannot have a territorial demarcation or a devolution of power and resolve the problem of caste inequality or caste oppression, because there is no territorial solution there. It requires a different set of resolutions within the territorial framework itself, whether at the state level, whether at the national level. These are questions of detail. But as I said, that even the question of individual freedom cannot be pushed forward without the question of resolving collective Azadi, the question of collective Azadi, not simply of the ones that have a territorial resolution, but of the others, which is questions of such as caste and gender and class. Finally, let me end by saying why in all of this, I think the university in particular has a very important role to play. In at least, well, maybe even three different senses. First of all, the university is the place where there is the full potential to collect and think about the knowledge of how people live, what people want, what people are claiming. All of these things can be observed and brought together in the form of analytical and systematically organized knowledge. That is the job of the university. This is not something that government departments can do. It is the university where this kind of collection of knowledge, that you might say knowledge of the country. It is the university where knowledge of the country is actually critically examined and thought about. Which is why the place of the university is particularly important here. The second is, of course, that it's in the university that you can have a critical engagement of different points of view over these questions of individual and collective freedoms. It is in the university which offers that place for a serious engagement and even debates, the kind of debates that would not be possible in the political battlefield or a television talk show, is possible in the university. And the third reason is, and this I think is a particularly important point in India, and especially for universities such as JNU, because the university is also a place where students, particularly students, but also teachers, from a variety of backgrounds, all of these different groups and communities and regions and so on that we have been talking about for so long, it is in the university that they come together. But not only do they come together in a place where knowledge, the serious pursuit of knowledge, is what people practice. In other words, what the university allows for is the bringing together within a single space where people speak or are encouraged to speak in a common language, the language of whatever discipline or whatever science is being pursued, speak a common language. People from different communities and regions and classes and castes come together and speak in that common language on a footing of equality. This is a particularly creative environment in which this kind of critical thinking about the country can be pursued. I do not think that there is any other institution in the country which offers quite this kind of environment, which is why I think the assault that has come on the university is such a dangerous thing and should be resisted with all the force that we have. I will stop here.